Okay, welcome to the podcast. It's the Godward Show. I'm your host, Casey, and we're doing Polybius today. I'm excited. I really am excited. I like this book a lot, and I've only read it once. But, like I've said before, teaching a thing is how you learn it. So let's do it. I am definitely not an expert in Polybius, but I am a huge fan. His major work, this one, The Histories, does not survive intact totally. There were originally 40 books or chapters in this work, but most people today only read the first 6 or 5 books of the histories. This one contains 6, which are most of what survives. Apparently, no one really read Polybius to the end, even in the old days. Dionysius of Halicarnassus said of the histories in the 3rd century that, quote, no one has the endurance to reach its end. But honestly, that joke sort of baffles me because I really loved almost every page of the first 6 books of this work. I mean, history is always a little bit dry, I suppose, because, it can't compete with the constructions we find in epic poetry and novels, which intentionally, tug at our emotions. But for what history is, it seems to me, and I'm not a historian by trade, but it seems to me that Polybius ought to be considered the historian's historian. He packs a huge punch, not merely in terms of what he's reporting, which is awesome, by the way, as it involves things like Hannibal and Hanno and Hamilcar out of Carthage with their mercenary armies marching up through Spain and into the Alps into northern Italy and making their way to sack Rome, with war elephants and making deals with the duplicitous Gauls along the way. The Gauls who, by the way, marched and even fought totally naked. I mean, come on. If this doesn't interest you, maybe history isn't exactly what you're looking for. But on top of, all this stuff, Polybius also makes some really interesting points about what I think is called historiography, or the theory of history. Which is interesting. I mean, this guy's living in the 2nd century BC. It suggests that we maybe because only so much of this stuff survives into the modern world. Most of it is lost. And so we're the ancient world, it had Tacitus and Livy and Plutarch and Polybius and a few others. Suetonius might be my next episode, by the way. But it's well, yeah, but those are the ones that survived, right? There may have been hundreds, even thousands of other historians writing at the same time. And so historiography is the development of the theory of history. It's what should historians be doing? It's very similar to what's happening, nowadays. There are people who will debate that stuff, right? So it's interesting that the Romans were doing this, or the Greeks or Romans were doing this, 200 years BC or so. By the way, in his historiography, I love it. It's so endearing. He really lambasts other historians for doing it all wrong, I guess I'm a sucker for anyone who has that sort of Salvador Dali confidence where he says, well, what's Dali say? I don't do drugs, I am drugs. Or, basically just to say, I'm the best at this and everyone else isn't in my league. Polybius has that kind of confidence when he talks about what a historian should be doing. Anyway, this guy Polybius was born around 200 BC in Megalopolis, Arcadia, which is in the Peloponnese during the time when it was part of the Achaean League, which I've mentioned in previous episodes. I'm going to come back to this in a minute maybe. But Greece was still relatively strong at this time, but Rome's republic was on the rise, or really empire, but republic, empire, whatever. I don't know that the distinction is perfectly clear when it comes to the edges of the empire and consolidating, Italy and so on. Polybius's father was a statesman, and so his son, Polybius, spent a lot of time, near the big shots in the Greek world, observing their politics, riding horses, hunting with them, rubbing elbows with the important people. Then when he was 33 years old, he was taken captive by Rome. The Romans, like, there was some kind of a war or something, and they didn't trust his father, and they took like 1,000 or 100 prisoners hostage, something like that. That's how he ended up in Rome when he was 33 years old. And they, the Romans, were very impressed by his refinement, his culture, because he was so good with horses and good at hunting. And so he became a member of what is called the Scipionic Circle, so that even when he was formally released after 17 years of captivity, he stayed on and decided to travel with one of the Scipios to watch and sort of like record the very famous sack of Carthage, this huge sort of military clash. In his histories, Polybius mostly covers the period of time between about 264 BC and 146 BC. This was basically the period of Rome's rise, and it culminates with Rome subduing Carthage and thereby basically achieving unrivaled dominance in the Mediterranean. But none of it was easy, and it's really fun to read, how they did it. So I'm going to share some of my favorite parts of the book, or of the description, in this video, including how to ferry 37 elephants across a river in a pinch, and also how to handle what Polybius calls womanish petulance in female politicians, and maybe even something about how it is naive to pretend that conspiring Celts aren't trying to subvert your institutions. Okay, there are conspiracies, Polybius would reassure us. Before I get into all of that, one more note about why I'm doing this. I mean, in part because I have all these books, the Oxford University Press classics. I really like them. And I'm basically reading the whole series. But it does beg the question, how did they decide which books should go in the series? Or how am I deciding which books should be a part of my podcast? Good question, right? What is the canon? In some ways, this episode, I think, belongs in fact, I almost could make a playlist maybe, but it belongs in a mini series with my other episode on Thucydides, with my other episode on Josephus, and the episode on Heraclitus. Because, among other things, what this book demonstrates is the chronic intensity of the strife and almost the unbroken thread of bloodshed and war, subversion, conspiracy, genocide, enslavement, rape, and all around carnage that characterized the world before the coming of Logos. If, by the way, if you're tired of being evangelized and you roll your eyes because I sound like E. Michael Jones, and if you've had enough of this point on the internet, I really suspect you still don't get it. There simply did not exist a solution for the problems of intertribal strife before the time of Heraclitus. And even then, it took centuries to get people to sort of shift mindsets, to get to see what was happening and to get to see the solution and make it popular. But this is the process that's sort of happening in Polybius's lifetime, and he's so close to being aware of it. He doesn't quite use the term logos, I don't think. I mean, he was writing in Latin. I'm not sure what the Latin equivalent is, but it's happening, right? Part of the value, I think he was writing in Latin. Maybe he wrote in Greek. I'll have to look into that and see if he used that word logos. The value of these historical works then is in part to shock modern people into realizing that even now, even 2,000 years later, we are still, I think, the beneficiaries of truly a political miracle. So even if you don't believe in God, I mean, which I pity, but even if you don't, or maybe even especially if you don't, you can learn to see that only a political miracle, and I mean a supernatural intervention. What do I mean by that? I mean something that can't be explained by customary punditry. Okay, this is something like sort of big. It's like emergent. You know what that means? Like it's bigger than nobody like had this idea themselves. It started to. It became. It was like dictated by reality. That's the idea, and you can learn to see this if you read Polybius closely. Nothing short of that logos, this is part of my argument, could have turned the Mediterranean, eventually Europe itself, into a place where peoples could travel freely, build cathedrals, and generally exist without having to think about how to raise another generation of young men as quickly as possible to die in some obscure trireme battle. In general, my thesis is that political alliances like, for example, the Achaean League or the Delian League were like early attempts to forge the kinds of peace necessary for living the good life. But that ultimately, only the coming of a new consciousness, a widespread shift in mindset in the form of Christianity, proved sufficient to transform civilization from a civilization of like all out competition, the war of all against all, to a civilization where, in group allegiance remained real, but stable alliances could be formed among men who shared this new faith. So, written around 130 BC, it's really interesting to hear Polybius say things like, quote, the growth of Achaean power and their progress toward unity have been remarkable. There had been many attempts in the past to unify the Peloponnesian, but none of them succeeded because each state was interested only in its own supremacy, not in freedom for all alike. End quote. Okay, so like you can see here that there's this idea emerging that like we don't all just have to be separate city-states constantly fighting with each other. As if you really go back and watch that Thucydides episode, you'll see what I'm saying. Okay, so anyway, listen to how he sets up his task as a historian on about the third page of this magnum opus. He says, sorry, have you ever had, what are those things called? I'll think of it in a minute, and I get like in my teeth. Anyway, he says, quote, the point is that the distinctive feature of my work, which is at the same time the remarkable feature. Hold on one sec. Hello? I'm doing something. What do you need? She's on a walk. You good? Okay. So let's see. Back to the point is that the distinctive feature of my work is this, quote, fortune has turned almost all the events of the known world in a single direction and has forced everything to tend towards the same goal. A historian, then, should use his work to bring under a single conspectus for his readers the means by which fortune has brought everything to this point. In fact, it was this in particular that originally prompted me to set about writing history, and then also the fact that no one else in our times has attempted to write a universal history, because otherwise I would have been far less inclined to do so. Okay, so what does he mean here? He's saying that, like, look, the world is becoming increasingly interconnected. And so you can't just tell the story of Rome, because the story of Rome involves the whole known world. So part of what he's going to try to do in this book is to like explain it all. Okay, a universal history. Okay, let's see. To accomplish such a task, Polybius has to become like really a storyteller. So that is, he thinks very carefully about how and in what order to present so many seemingly divergent threads, so that when they all converge, the reader will be able to see exactly what he means by saying that, quote, fortune has turned almost all the events of the known world in a single direction. This, to me at least, is a really fascinating idea, especially as our own world seems to be approaching like a similar, eschaton, like an end point, like, and it seems to be this process that's almost like mechanical, um, driven by fortune, you might say, right? As if it were a law of nature. You've got this emerging international U.S. empire, and it's going to be like the final fruit of this epoch. And like I think a good historian might eventually try to show how pretty much everything that has happened anywhere in the past 100 years has been like sort of pushing this process to its seemingly predetermined end. Among the different threads Polybius juggles, for example, he starts off by telling of the Romans' first military excursion overseas around 264 AD, how they unified Italy. But then he also tells of the Greek world and how their own sort of military and political stuff was happening, and he tells of what's going on in Carthage over in northern Africa and how they live and what forces compelled their military leaders to undertake a military venture up to Rome. And so you have to read all of these different threads sort of separately first, and only then as you get to book 4 and 5 do you see how really they're all like interconnected. So that is a complicated kind of history writing, and Polybius is like self-aware of how complicated it is. I mean, it's really an accomplishment. The first beheadings happen on page 9, the first crucifixions on page 11, and it's not until page 73 that we get the first cannibalism. So I'm not going to dwell quite as much as I have in past videos on the very graphic descriptions of the violence that come in this book, as I did in those other videos, but believe me, they're there, and they're there on almost every page. Polybius is really interesting for, as I said, these historiographical digressions. For example, when he goes off on like a sort of tangent about the proper role of the historian, I'll give you one example here on page like early on 13. He says, let me see, where am I there? Oh, sorry, 14. Okay, now, although there is no reason to dispense with such partiality in other areas of life, for instance, loyalty to friends and country are good qualities, as is having the same enemies and friends as one's friends. When a man takes on the role of historian, he must put all such considerations out of his mind. He often has to speak well of his enemies, and even honor them with words of undiluted praise when their actions demand it. And he often has to challenge and censure his closest friends unforgivingly, when their errors suggest that this is appropriate. An animal is completely useless if it loses its eyesight. And in the same way, history without truth has little educational value as a yarn or a story. That is why a historian should not hesitate either to condemn his friends or praise his enemies. So pretty interesting. I mean, it gives you a sense of his negative capability or whatever. And I think even better than that, or at least maybe this is just my opinion, but more fun than that sort of is when Polybius weighs in almost as like a philosopher, drawing moral lessons from the scenes he describes. For example, quote, "I have recorded these events in the hope that my readers will profit from them. Opportunities for changing one's life for the better are afforded by both one's own setbacks and those of others. And while learning from personal disasters drives the lesson home most forcefully, learning from others' afflictions is less painful. There is no teacher better at preparing one for real life than the experience of reading political history, because only political history delivers, without pain, the ability to judge the better course of action, whatever the occasion or the situation." So pretty interesting. The first clash between Carthaginian commanders, Hannibal and Hanno, and on the other hand, the Roman forces, was over the ownership of Sicily. In this example, Hannibal brought about 50 war elephants into the fight, which I really have nothing to say about except isn't that awesome. Also, Numidian horsemen. Basically, anyone who grew up playing Civilization 4 should know a lot of the advantages such war animals provide. Here's a short description of how the elephants were used. Quoting, Xanthippus ordered the elephant drivers to push forward and smash the enemy lines, and the cavalry on both wings to wheel simultaneously into the attack. At the same moment, the Romans clattered their spears against their shields, as is their custom, and charged forward, whooping their battle cries. But the Roman horsemen on both wings were so heavily outnumbered by their Carthaginian counterparts that before long they were in full flight. As for the infantry, those assigned to the left wing avoided the elephant charge and attacked the Carthaginian right. They routed the mercenaries, from whom they had not expected any trouble anyway, and harried them all the way back to the camp. Meanwhile, the aggression of the Carthaginian elephants collapsed the first ranks of those deployed against them, and they fell back, crushed underfoot and dying in heaps on the battlefield. Pretty amazing. Let me see. So subsequent to this clash, the Romans sort of finally realized that they had to take to sea. It's a really interesting description. I mean, he describes like their whole process of building like a harbor and the ship construction and how they got notes on it from like the Greeks or whatever. It took them a while to crank up the whole industry. And they're doing it like in the middle of an ongoing war. But soon enough, their ships were comparable to any from the famous Greek fleets. Polybius even mentions some of their technological innovations. The one that I remember best is this thing that you can even Google this. I'm pretty sure if you Google like shipbuilding and the Raven. The Raven was this thing that like was I think I'm going to tell you my version of it from memory. I think it was this big, long, huge pole, probably comparable to the size of the mainmast on these sailing ships, standing either next to the mainmast or like on one of the edges of the ship. And as the ship pulled up alongside one of the enemy ships, they would drop this thing like a hammer, like and it would hook in to the enemy ship. So like this huge giant anvil thing goes crashing into the ship's plank, and now like you're hooked into the enemy ship, and I think you could walk across the thing to get on there. So pretty amazing bit of innovation and fun to read about stuff like that. Polybius also makes some interesting observations about the nature of multicultural institutions. Listen to how he describes the Carthaginian military. By the way, the Carthaginians were, my understanding is Semitic in origin, living over in like where is that, like Libya or like west of Libya, somewhere over there, right? And so like maybe just listen to about 2 paragraphs on this. I think it's, to me, sort of interesting. Basically, the Carthaginians are like so rich at the time that they don't fight their own wars. They start hiring mercenaries to fight the wars for them. So here's 2 paragraphs. Once the entire mercenary army had gathered in Sicca, Hanno, the Carthaginian general responsible at that time for Libya, made an official visit. But so far from satisfying their expectations and paying them what they felt they were owed, he cited the burden of the indemnity and the general poverty of the city in an attempt to get them to forego even some of what they were contractually owed. The immediate effect of his words was a mutinous rift, and the men held meeting after meeting, some in their separate ethnic units, others that were general assemblies. But all the different peoples and languages created nothing but an incoherent muddle, and the state of the army may truly be described as one of frenzy. Carthaginian armies always relied on foreign troops from various places, and while ethnic pluralism in an army is a good way of reducing the chances of concerted dissidence or insubordination, it is a very bad idea when the men are resentful or hostile or mutinous and need to have things explained to them, to be calmed down, and to have their false impressions corrected. Okay, and then he says, which is exactly what happened at the time I am talking about. In the army, as well as Libyans, who made up the largest unit, there were Iberians and Celts, a contingent of Ligurians, and another from the Balearic Islands, and quite a few Greek half-breeds, most of whom were deserters and slaves. It was impossible, then, to convene a general assembly or to find any other way to communicate with them all at once. However, could it have been possible? Their commanding officer could not conceivably know all their languages, and it was, I dare say, even less feasible for him to address the troops via translators, which would mean repeating every point 4 or 5 times. Then he says at the beginning of the next paragraph, the upshot was a complete jumble of uncertainty, distrust, and failed communication. So that was Carthage, and that was their army at the time. Kind of interesting, like I said. All right, I won't say too much else about Polybius. Oh wait, I did want to mention his description of Queen Tuta in Book 2. I guess I won't even quote about it. I mean, she's this queen who like accedes to the, is that the word, or rises to the throne after her husband dies, and it's just interesting to read Polybius for his like very, very traditional pre-modern, like he has very like early republic energy, and what do I mean by that? I mean he's unself-consciously patriarchal in his like mindset. He speaks of Tuta's womanish petulance and does not hesitate to use phrases like given the way a woman's mind works, dot dot dot. Again, with like laughably unself-conscious condescension. In the part of this book, in this part of the book, we read about Rome's military expedition up in Illyria and into Eastern Europe, which also involved a war on the Italian Celts. Polybius's description of the Gauls is really fun, like pleasing to read. It generally anticipates Tacitus, if I remember correctly, sort of, which, there's there's these like national character traits, right, where he talks about how they are hot-headed and duplicitous and self-destructive. Nevertheless, he says their courage matched that of the Romans. And as I said, that it's pretty cool to see them, like, or to read about them fighting naked, right? They just carry a sword and a shield. I mean, it's unbelievable because these guys march through the Alps, like famously, right? This book also contains that famous scene of Hannibal marching his troops through the Alps, and like they have to like, it's pretty amazing. I mean, really, because they're bringing horses and elephants and like some crazy number of men, like 80,000 men or something, and 6,000 horses up through the Swiss Alps, or I don't know if Swiss, but the Italian Alps there. Because maybe I'll show you. Yeah, I'll post a image here if I can find one of like the route from North Africa that what's his name, Hannibal and his men took as they were like marching up to like northern Italy, and then eventually we're going to go down into Rome and make their effort at a sack there. They had to cross the Po River. There's a really memorable scene of them trying to cross this river with, I think he says 37 elephants, and it's like step one is build some very sturdy rafts. Like that's basically what they do, and then they have to scare these elephants onto the rafts, and then somehow because the elephants don't want to, because they're reluctant about the water, so they get them onto these giant sturdy rafts and then like push them one at a time off. And I guess there are like, I think there were like it couldn't have been that there were men on the thing. They would have been, I'm not sure how they did it, like dragging them across this thing. And some like 3 or 4 of the elephants panicked and jumped into the water. And he reports how they put their big the snout thing out of the water. What is that called? An elephant's nose. Anyway, so great stuff and really interesting to read. And then like in sort of like in that area around like the Alps and northern Italy, there's all these Celtic tribes that they basically just like pay off to become mercenaries with them. And I mean, it's probably just like Roman, what do we call it? Like Roman bigotry or something. But like in part, the Celts do seem like they didn't have their act together. I mean, anyone could show up and be like, "Hey, will you fight with us? We'll pay you whatever." And these naked men would be like, "Yeah, let's go kill some people or something." So that's most of this. Now, look, I'm not going to try to summarize the whole story. And I also wanted to mention, as I said, we only get through the first 6 books of this, really 5. And then he like pauses and we don't have the whole rest of it. So it's not exactly clear like the outcome. He doesn't get all the way up to the present in the extant or existing or surviving literature that we have. There was one other idea I was going to tell you about here. And then before I make my last point, he also, like, I think it's in book 6, he goes into this kind of long, I think it's a digression, although it's basically how this part of it ends. Because we either lost the rest of it or like it wasn't printed in this version of the book. But it's interesting because he talks of, in very similar terms to Plato, and in fact he mentions Plato, about like the succession of regimes from one to the next. He talks about a kingship, about tyranny, about democracies, and about the Greek and the Roman constitutions and so on. And so if you're interested in sort of like political history, then it is book 6 of Polybius that you'd be most interested in. He's not really talking here about things that happened in history, but he's talking about like it's closer to political philosophy, I suppose. For example, he says, our position then should be that there are 6 kinds of constitution. The 3 commonly recognized ones I have just mentioned, and 3 more which are congenital with them: tyranny, oligarchy, ochlocracy, or mob rule. In the natural spontaneous course of events, the first system to arise is monarchy, and this is followed by kingship, but it takes the deliberate correction of the defects of monarchy for it to develop into kingship. Kingship changes into its congenital vice, that is, into tyranny, and then it is the turn of aristocracy after the dissolution of tyranny. Aristocracy necessarily degenerates into oligarchy, and when the general populace get impassioned enough to seek redress for the crimes committed by their leaders, democracy is born. And in due course of time, once democracy turns to violating and breaking the law, mob rule arises and completes the series. And again, this is Plato, Republic, sections 562b to 566b, if you're interested in making a comparison there. Okay, so that's most of Polybius. I have 2 more pages I wanted to read to you from. Back to this question of logos, which is kind of the greater theme of my podcast. First, listen to this section on page 114 in book 2. He says, quote, and this is part of the war with where is this? War with this guy Aratus and the how's that go? Megalopolitans or whatever. And basically trying to unify the Peloponnese, okay? So he says, quote, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to know the names. Just listen to kind of what he says here. The envoys asked Antigonus to consider the possibilities. Would his interests be better served by fighting alongside the Achaeans and Boeotians in the Peloponnese to stop Cleomenes becoming the dominant power in Greece? Or would he prefer to fight in Thessaly, where the issue would be Macedonian supremacy against a combined force of Aetolians, Boeotians, Achaeans, and Spartans? Because that is what would happen if he abandoned the largest of the Greek leagues. At the moment, they said, the Aetolians were pretending to be neutral out of gratitude for the good turn the Achaeans did them during Demetrius's reign. If this carried on, the Achaeans would resist Cleomenes by themselves, and perhaps would need no outside assistance as long as fortune was on their side. But what if fortune opposed them? What if the Aetolians joined the offensive against them? They urged him to see that he had the perfect opportunity to help the Peloponnesians while they could still be saved. So basically, this was like an appeal to join our party. It'll be better for you. Don't you see, man? Right? Like, that's the idea there. I know that's kind of hard to understand that out of context. But then, I think this part will be easier for you. Listen to what he says a couple hundred pages later. And this is, this is pure politics. Again, you don't have to believe in God, really, to understand this. But I think that if you really understand it, you do have to kind of start to see like, okay, even if you don't want to call it God, call it the natural law or something like that, right? That there seem to be givens, there seems to be like limits on reality, and these Greeks were like realizing it around this time in history. And that's what I mean by the coming of logos. It's like we need to get our civilizations in step with reality, okay? And reality had changed in the past 1,000 years. So, we're not going to keep doing the Iliad forever. We have new technologies. We're living closer together. We've seen the horror of just sort of churning out, one generation after another of dead men to fight in these terrible wars, right? Okay, so you get it. Listen to this part. I'm almost done here. Do I have time to get through this? I hope I do. Okay. Okay, like I said, 200 pages later, quote, Greeks should never, he's quoting this guy, Egelas of Naupactus, okay? So, Greeks, he said, should never go to war against one another. It would be a great blessing from the gods if the Greeks could speak and act as one. If they could join hands, as people do when fording a river, to repel barbarian incursions and keep themselves and their cities from harm. Even if that was too much to expect, he recommended that, under current circumstances, they should cooperate and take precautions in view of the massive armies to the west and the major war that was being fought there. Even people who even now paid little attention to world affairs could not be blind to the fact that whether the Carthaginians or the Romans won the war, it was inconceivable that the victors would rest content with rulership of Italy and Sicily. No, he said, they would come with excessive intentions and forces to match. And so he asked everyone to take precautionary measures against the crisis. So this gives you a sense that, like, look, there are others, there are outsiders, there are barbarians, non-Greeks, and they are coming for us. Okay, they will come for us. You can't just live in your little city-state and expect no one to try to like take you down. Okay, so instead he sees the reality of the situation. If we band together as Greeks, right, not as Spartans and Thessalonians and Corinthians, but as Greeks, greater Greeks, and refuse to fight wars against each other, at least for the time being, then, perhaps we can be victorious against outsiders. What I like about this is that, again, like, to me, this seems like the coming of Logos. It is the suggestion of reality itself that we need to start cooperating here. But it is not a slippery slope. Like, yes, there's going to be some cooperation between the various city-states, but they're still distinguishing between Greeks and barbarians, insiders and outsiders. Yes, they've like widened the circle some, but it doesn't become universalism in any of the minds of these, historians or philosophers or theologians even for a long, long time. That is a very modern, very new kind of idea. Polybius takes it for granted that there will be outsiders forever and that there's always going to be wars and stuff, but he does seem to see that certain amounts of cooperation are like almost commanded by the universe, by nature, by reality, something like that. Okay, so that, again, this was written in about 130 BC. I'm trying to kind of, fill out, I mean, this is for me as much as for you. Like, it's been a long time since, like I guess not a long time, it's been like 2 years or so since I've wanted to like fill out my picture of the classical world, building up to and then subsequent to the life of Jesus, basically. Like that's the centerpiece for me. And so I want to understand like what, and well, anyway, what I think I understand or what I see in it is just strife, war, conflict, and betrayal and like all those scary things. And it's not to say that like Christianity solved all that perfectly and forever, but it certainly did reduce it. It allowed for, basically like the Mediterranean and then greater Europe to start to cooperate against true outsiders. And true outsiders would be, people who just like were not willing to cooperate, who were showing up to conquer. And, again, like this is a pretty fascinating like aspect of political history that for me is starting to overlap pretty clearly with like theological thought and philosophical thought, right? So that what you see here is that these are not like, it's not as if theology is some irrelevant, like, sort of masturbatory fantasy thing. And it's also not as if politics is without its questions of like without its higher or transcendent questions. Because in order to be effective politically, you do have to think about like, how to recognize authority and who you can trust, and like about shared or divergent values and all those kinds of things. So that's part of the reason I've been so interested in reading things like this very good book by Polybius and Tacitus and Josephus. And, I think, yeah, my next episode, I'll do Suetonius, who comes a little bit later, maybe 2 centuries after Polybius, and he starts to report on basically the Roman Empire. And it's fun to see some of the decadence and like, degeneracy, really, of like the Roman Empire, the High Roman Empire. All right, that's it for this episode. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. The Patreon link is below this video. I would appreciate your support. Goodbye.